Hello again, everybody. My name is Dr. Jacob Graham, and in this video, we're going to learn about the final category of dissonant voice-leading chords, auxiliary chords, mainly using examples this time by Tchaikovsky. As we will see, these chords are related to the neighbor note dissonance that we learned about in the video on 3-to-1 counterpoint in two voices. But auxiliary chords also include some other kinds of dissonance that don't occur in strict counterpoint exercises. Here is Tchaikovsky's diagram showing first how lower neighbor notes can be used to elaborate any of the chord members of a root position C major triad. And the same thing with upper neighbors. These are diatonic neighbors, moving away from and returning to the chord tone by a diatonic step. These are the only kinds of neighbors possible in strict counterpoint. In free composition, chromatic neighbors are also possible, the most frequent of which are the chromatic lower neighbors below the chordal third and the chordal fifth. It is less common to use chromatic upper neighbors, although when they are used, they stand out more to the ear. Tchaikovsky then shows how simultaneous upper and lower neighbors can be combined to produce dissonant neighbor chords. These neighbor chords usually occur on weak beats, and they have chord figures that should look familiar from our other videos on dissonant voice-leading chords. The same chord figures could be created through passing or suspension dissonances, for instance. In the top example, Tchaikovsky shows neighbor notes moving in parallel motion in the top two voices over a stationary bass voice. And in the lower example, he shows simultaneous neighbors and passing tones in the lower voices, including some chromatic neighbors in the first measure. Then, in the third measure, he shows how neighbors can be combined in contrary motion. The music theorist Felix Salzer used this diagram to show some of the more common dissonant chord types that can be formed by simultaneous neighbors in the upper parts over a stationary bass. Salzer would use analytic notation to indicate neighboring chords by labeling the chord with a capital N, and I would also use a dashed slur to show the repetition of the prolonged triad at the beginning and end of the neighboring motion. It is also possible to form neighboring chords over a moving bass, in cases where the bass moves in a neighbor note pattern with the other voices. Notice that the dissonant chord types in most of the examples happen to form inversions of the dominant seventh chord. Here's an example of exactly this kind of neighboring chord in a theme by Mozart. Focusing on the left-hand accompaniment, we can identify 4 chords in this passage. In the first two measures, we move from a 1 chord to a dominant 7th in 4-3 position. And in the 3rd and 4th measures, we reverse direction and go from the 5-4-3 back to 1. We can compare this to a model that demonstrates how a root position triad can be displaced by a 4-3 neighboring chord. This model is quite abstract. It looks like a strict combined species counterpoint exercise, much more than Mozart's actual notes. But both of them demonstrate the same underlying voice leading. A dissonant chord is introduced and resolved through neighboring motion. There are a few different ways of annotating a score to communicate this interpretation of the voice leading, but in cases with a moving bass line, I prefer to keep the Roman numerals for each measure and to add a dashed slur connecting the prolonged D major triads, and finally labeling the slur with a capital N to show the neighboring voice leading function. The next few measures of Mozart's theme also feature some interesting neighboring motion. The G major triad on the downbeat of measure 5 can also be considered a neighboring chord, this time over a stationary bass note D. When neighbor chords are formed over a stationary bass tone, they are often indicated with figured bass symbols that show the neighboring motion, rather than with Roman numerals. Here, we start with a 5-3 figured bass symbol aligned on top of the Roman numeral 1 in measure 4. The chordal 5th moves to a 6th above the bass and back, while the chordal 3rd moves to the dissonant 4th and back. This notation looks a lot like the notation for the dissonant chords that we analyzed in the video on passing chords. This neighboring 6-4 pattern is repeated in measure 6. Then in measure 7, we get a 5-6-5 chord moving back to a root position 1, and this inverted dominant 7th chord could also be considered to have a neighboring function, since it is entirely made from stepwise motion, just like the inverted dominants in measures 2 and 3. In measure 8, we finally get a different root position harmony, a 5 chord. This dominant chord is the harmonic goal of the first 8 measures, and all of the dissonant chords up until this point can be seen as voice-leading expansions of the tonic function. One way to indicate harmonic function is with uppercase letters positioned below the Roman numerals, capital T for tonic function, D for dominant function, and sometimes a capital P for predominant. This way of marking up a score allows us to distinguish between chords at 3 levels of resolution: important changes of harmonic functions at the bottom, mid-level chord changes indicated by the Roman numerals, and decorative voice-leading chords indicated by the figured bass symbols above the Roman numerals. Here is a very beautiful example of a chromatic neighboring chord from the main theme of Schubert's Quintet in C major. The first 4 measures of the example are an expansion of the 1 chord through chromatic neighboring motion. In this case, I needed to indicate the 5th of the chord twice in the figured bass in order to show the upper neighbor 6th and the lower chromatic neighbor sharp 4. Schubert adds another little melodic neighboring 6th before we progress to the next chord in measure 7, which is a neighboring 5-6-5 that moves directly back to the root position tonic. On the downbeat of measure 8, we see a D minor triad in first inversion, that is elaborated with a 7/6 melodic suspension in the first violin. On the third beat of the measure, the upper voices stay on the same chord tones, but the bass moves from F to F sharp. This chord should best be thought of as an applied dominant that resolves to the 5 chord in the next measure. See the video on the thorough bass of dominant sevenths if you want a refresher on that. On the downbeat of measure 9, we get a really wild kind of dissonant voice leading chord, and I'll return to explain this chord at the end of the video. But even without identifying a single category for this voice leading chord, like a passing, a neighbor, or a suspension chord, we can still show the underlying dissonance resolution using figured bass symbols above the Roman numeral. A dissonant fourth, resolving down by step to the chordal third in the first violin, a raised seventh, resolving to the root in the second violin, and a lowered sixth, resolving to the chordal fifth in the viola. This G major triad continues into measure 10, when its chord members are repeated up in a higher register, this time pianissimo. Just like with the Mozart example, we can indicate harmonic function within this phrase beneath the Roman numerals. The first 7 measures all belong to the tonic region of the phrase. This tonic function is expanded and prolonged using chromatic and diatonic neighboring chords. Measure 8 expresses predominant harmonic function, and the dominant is reached as the goal of the phrase on the downbeat of measure 9. This is a very typical design for classical themes, where the initial tonic function takes up the majority of the duration of the phrase and is activated by various kinds of voice-leading dissonance. So far in the video, we've looked exclusively at textbook neighboring chords. The rest of this video is going to be dedicated to the more advanced kinds of auxiliary dissonances that are related to the neighbor note, but do not fit so easily into that category. In the same section of his textbook dedicated to neighbor notes, Tchaikovsky also shows irregular neighbors, like this example of dissonant non-chord tones approached by leap instead of by step. There aren't any dissonances in strict counterpoint that are allowed to be introduced by leap, but these kinds of dissonances are common in free composition. Why would Tchaikovsky, or any other musician of the 19th century, consider this kind of dissonance to be related to the neighbor note at all? Why not think of it as its own type of dissonance? To explain this, I need to take a step back and unpack some of the vocabulary. Many of the old music theory treatises were written in different European languages, mainly Italian, German, or French, and sometimes even Latin, and they were translated back and forth. Some of the terms had direct cognates in different languages and could be easily translated, but others did not. One difficult language barrier that still persists in modern music theory has to do with the neighbor note. The German prefix neben does not mean the same thing as the English term neighbor, even though in German, approaching a dissonance by step and then moving back to the original consonants is referred to as a Nebennote. Neben as a prefix literally means side, secondary, or auxiliary. Hugo Riemann gave this definition of the Nebennote in his Music Lexicon of 1882, where in the English edition, the term is instead translated as auxiliary note. Auxiliary notes are in the shake, mordent, turn, battement, etc., the upper and under second of the note to be ornamented, and which is properly called the principal tone. Also, in the case of a suspension, the note held on before the note of the chord is called an auxiliary note. Passing notes and changing notes are Wechselnoten, which means accented passing tones, can also be classed as auxiliary notes, melodic auxiliary notes, while every note belonging to the chord is a principal note. According to this definition, an auxiliary note is any dissonant non-chord tone that can be related stepwise to a chord member. That includes the neighbor note pattern, but it also includes suspensions, accented and unaccented passing tones, appoggiaturas, escape tones, and other dissonances from free composition. But unlike with those other dissonances, the Germans did not have a term that referred exclusively to what we would call a neighbor note, so they simply used the term Nebennote instead. Unfortunately, the problem was compounded by the German-speaking students of Heinrich Schenker, such as Felix Salzer, who we mentioned earlier, who emigrated to the United States in the 1930s prior to World War II. Most of the analytic notation that I use on this channel, such as the dashed slurs shown here, is adapted from Salzer. As far as I know, Salzer was the first to introduce the term incomplete neighbor to refer to the other kinds of auxiliary notes that he would have known in his native language as Nebennote, but that his students in America would not have recognized as a neighbor note. He would say to think of these dissonances as a neighbor note pattern where the initial consonants or the return to the consonants is omitted. American Schenkerians often still refer to such incomplete neighbors as prefixes and suffixes, depending on whether the dissonance occurs before or after the chord tone that it modifies. In this video, I'm going to refer to all of these kinds of dissonances as auxiliary tones, which in my opinion is a more historically accurate term. Returning to Tchaikovsky's example, we can imagine the missing chord tones from the downbeat that would be part of our understanding if we were to view these auxiliary tones as incomplete neighbor note prefixes. Just as well, we could view them as auxiliary tones introduced by leap and resolving down by step in the manner of an appoggiatura. And you'll remember that appoggiaturas are one of the kinds of auxiliary notes. Tchaikovsky composed this final example in order to demonstrate a variety of different auxiliary tones. Just as before, we could take Salzer's explanation of these auxiliary tones as incomplete neighbors, where not only are the initial consonances omitted, but the dissonances are also shifted metrically to be aligned on an accented part of the meter. Tchaikovsky himself explains these downbeat auxiliary tones differently. In his opinion, these sound more like incorrectly prepared suspensions, or, in the case of the first two measures, suspensions that are prepared in a different voice. The melodic C on beat 3 of the first measure was prepared in the bass voice of the preceding chord. The D on the next downbeat was also prepared by the preceding bass note, while the bass note G on the third beat of the second measure was prepared by the tenor voice, in the correct register this time. The auxiliary tones in the third measure cannot be viewed as suspensions prepared in a different voice, since those tones didn't occur as chord members of the preceding chord at all. Tchaikovsky shows in this way that downbeat auxiliary tones do not need to be prepared in the preceding chord. The auxiliary tones of the last measure of the example are chromatic, which produces chromatic cross relations with the chord members of the preceding chords. Tchaikovsky points out that these cross relations are acceptable in free composition because they are formed between a chord tone and a non-chord tone, rather than between chord tones of adjacent harmonies. Let's finish the video with some examples from real music of these kinds of dissonances at work, and learn how to analyze them. Here is the beginning of one of the more famous French horn solos in the repertoire, from the slow movement of Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony. These downbeat dissonances are good examples of suspensions prepared in a different voice. We annotate the score with exactly the same symbols we would use to show a normal 7/6 suspension, with the figured bass symbols displayed above the Roman numerals. In addition, though, we draw a solid arrow from whichever voice prepares the suspension to the actual melodic dissonance that occurs on the next downbeat. This next example is a beautiful melody by Chopin. Pay special attention to the non-chord tones of the right-hand melody. This melody moves mainly by arpeggiating through the tonic D-flat major triad until the downbeat of measure 4. This high B-flat is completely unprepared, making it a proper auxiliary tone that displaces the chordal fifth A-flat. This is shown in the figured bass symbols as a sixth connected by a line to the chordal fifth. As the melody descends, we get two more auxiliary tones, a raised second that displaces the chordal third, and a leading tone that displaces the chordal root. All three of these auxiliary tones could also be called Appoggiaturas, since they are introduced by leap and resolve by step in the opposite direction. On the downbeat of the fifth measure, we get a change of harmony at the same time that the melody leaps downwards to a dissonant auxiliary tone A natural. This auxiliary note lingers for the entire measure before resolving up to the chord tone B flat on the downbeat of measure 6. Salzer himself actually analyzes this A natural not as an appoggiatura, but as another category of auxiliary tone, the indirect passing tone. Salzer would say that we are dealing with a compound melody that has multiple contrapuntal lines within it. The lowest contrapuntal line ascends from this A-flat in measure 3 through the A natural in measure 5 on its way to the B-flat in measure 6. This same stepwise motion is seen more clearly within one of the inner voices of the accompaniment. Now, if you don't buy this particular example of an indirect passing tone, I would suggest the Disney song, "A Dream is a Wish Your Heart Makes," specifically on the words, "when you're fast asleep." So far, we have encountered at least 3 different forms of auxiliary dissonances that could be approached by leap. There is the appoggiatura, which is introduced by leap and resolved by step. The suspension, prepared in a different voice, where the suspension tone did belong to the preceding chord and so could have been correctly prepared if the voices were rearranged. And the indirect passing tone, where a passing motion is interrupted by intervening melodic notes. Distinguishing between these different categories will sometimes be difficult when analyzing a score of real music. Let's return once more to the strange chord from the Schubert example that I promised to explain. To refresh our ears, let's listen to the example once again. Notice that this chord on the downbeat of measure 9 is made up of exactly the same chromatic notes as the chord for measures 3 and 4, C, E flat, F sharp, and A, except that this time the note G occurs in the bass. Schubert had a tendency to reuse and recycle thematic dissonances and chromaticisms throughout his works as a kind of foreshadowing. And although the notes are the same here, the voice-leading function of the two chords is quite different. In the first case, the chord is easily explained through neighboring motion, while here, each of the voices has a slightly different linear function. The C in the first violin is an accented, indirect passing tone from the D in the preceding chord. The A in the second violin is a simple 9/8 suspension, while the F sharp is a suspension prepared by a different voice. The note E flat in the viola is a chromatic neighbor that decorates the common tone D, which is the root of the preceding chord, and it's the chordal fifth of the chord of resolution. It would be hard to give this chord a simple label, although if I was pressed, I would say it sounds to me most like a suspension chord. The point, though, is that these kinds of Frankenstein voice-leading chords occur very frequently in free composition, and the possibilities of combining different kinds of dissonance in the tonal common practice is nearly endless. That's all for this video. Stay tuned for the next one when we will be looking at a special kind of counterpoint exercise invented by Tchaikovsky. Bye for now.